Hello and welcome to GSF Podcast, sponsored by the Gary Sinise Foundation's Education and Outreach Initiative, aiming to educate the public on the importance of serving America's veterans, first responders, and their families. I am your host, Max Sinise, and today we have a very special guest with us, my dad, star of stage and screen, Gary Sinise.
Okay. Star of stage and screen. Okay.
I'm sorry, I have to include that every time.
I get it. Okay.
It's just too good. People use it all the time. But yeah, I'm very excited to do this with you, Dad, because it's, a huge part of the podcast that I want to focus on is really bridging that divide between the military and civilian communities. And I feel this, growing up with you and, all the stuff that you've done throughout the years, I think it kind of represents that because I feel like I had there was a big disconnect with me for a while in just understanding the work that you were doing. Right. And I feel like it's the same thing represented in the civilian community with the veteran community. So I wanted to kind of highlight that and dive deep into your motivations and kind of my perspective through it.
Okay.
So, so the first thing that I over the years and what the foundation says over and over is, these veterans, the military is these are our freedom providers and they are our freedom protectors. And, it's hard for, I think, people who have no experience with the military, but then also just see what the military is doing. It's just constant, foreign conflicts that are incredibly complex that I don't know what our veterans are doing, and I have no connection to that. All it is just conflict to me, and I don't really see the connection between those conflicts and my personal freedom that I enjoy day to day. So when did that kind of connection kind of solidify for you? And then I want to kind of go into how the Vietnam War conflict was a huge inspiration behind that.
Sure, Mac. In my book, I talk about a couple of the key moments that, kind of shaped my thinking that, what would it be that would turn me towards this kind of devoted life of service to our veterans. And there are key moments along the way, no doubt. I can't say that when I was your age, or at the time that I was doing all this, when you were 10, 11, 12 years old and in high school and everything like that, I can't say that when I was that age I had any clue what was going on. And that was during the height of the Vietnam War, when I was in high school. Yet I was completely disconnected. All I was thinking about was playing in bands and trying to survive, being a bad student in school and, interest in girls and, theater and all these things. And it was at the height of the Vietnam War. And images of the Vietnam War were coming onto the television every single night. The body counts, we were losing 500 people a week. To 500 to 1,000. I mean, the casualty rates were staggering, and we would see these images on television all the time. Yet they would somehow go right over my head, and I, even though my dad was in the Navy, my uncle was in World War II. Both uncles were in World War II. My grandfather was in World War I. They all served, and various veterans in my family. I was disconnected from their service as well. I never paid any attention to that at all. It was only after I got out of high school, and I met your mom, and her two brothers had served in Vietnam. One was a helicopter pilot, your uncle Arthur, combat assault helicopter pilot, and the other, your uncle Mac, who passed away in 1983. He was a West Point graduate, 2 tours in Vietnam, very serious military guy, military career. I know that if he had survived and lived on, he would have been about, in his late 50s at the time of the Iraq War. And he would have been probably, the way he was rising in the ranks and the way his career was going at that time, I have no doubt he would have been a general and would have been very involved in this. So it was meeting them and meeting your other uncle, Jack, who was a combat medic, and kind of learning from them and getting involved in some early support work in the Chicago area with regards to helping Vietnam veterans because I had met them through your mom. And that started to change things a little bit for me. All of a sudden, I started to look back at when I was in high school, and it wasn't that far away. I mean, I was only in my 20s at this time, but during high school, during the height of the Vietnam War, I wasn't paying attention at all. And so I started, after meeting these Vietnam veterans who were close to your mom, I started looking at what I was doing during the Vietnam War when they were over there serving in the jungles and getting shot at and having bad experiences, and then coming home, to a nation that was divided and turned its back on the Vietnam War. I started looking back at what I was doing during that period and feeling really guilty about it, just that I was so oblivious.
Yeah.
And I was kind of ashamed that I was so clueless in high school. Yet, I was a typical high school kid. I was just wanted to be a high school kid and play in bands and do my high school thing. But at the same time, we were sending guys over to Vietnam who were just a couple years older than I was, and they were going through some very difficult things. And then they came back to a nation that had pretty much completely turned his back on them at that time in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. There were, we had a draft at that time, so we were drafting people into the Army. That was difficult because that's where all the protests on college campuses came from, because people didn't agree with the war and they didn't want to be drafted to go fight the war, and so they protested the war, and so the nation was divided.
Do you think that's one of the? I mean, there's so many cultural changes happening in the country as well. But do you think that's one of the fundamental differences between our nation's approach to veterans now with the conflicts we have versus Vietnam? Is the draft is why there is so much kind of visceral anger towards and resentment towards veterans or something? Or?
Well, it's a little bit different now. I mean, I think there's a lot of people who remember what it was like for our veterans to come home from that war and to be basically made to feel like, that they should be ashamed of their service. Mm-hmm. And many of them just took off the uniform, never looked at it again, threw it in the closet, and pretended they didn't even serve. And they had to forget that they had served their country in Vietnam, and they went into the shadows and they hid. And I remember all that now very, very, very clearly because it was a motivator for me today to try to ensure that what was happening to our veterans, going off to war in Iraq and Afghanistan and places like that they wouldn't feel like that they would, if you're going to serve your country, I think, the nation should say, hey, okay, I'm going to do what I can to help you through this experience, even though I might not agree with the reasons you're going to fight.
Right.
I'm going to try to help you through that experience. And, that's what I decided to do after September 11th, when we started deploying to Afghanistan and Iraq and that terrible day and everything like that. I just remembered all too clearly what it was like back in the 80s when I was dealing with Vietnam veterans in Chicago and the pain that they were experiencing and the stories they shared with us. I took, there was the cast of the play Tracers I did it in Chicago that was written by a group of Vietnam veterans based on their experiences. And in preparation for that play, I took my cast to the local VA, and we sat there with groups of Vietnam veterans who were dealing with very serious post-traumatic stress, and they shared their stories with us, and it was eye-opening. It was painful. It was visceral. It was raw. And our guys, it galvanized our cast to say, oh, we're playing real people who went through real difficult things, and we're telling their stories, and we got to do it right. So I learned a lot in those early 80s about what it was like to be a veteran and have the nation not support you.
Yeah.
A series of events, getting involved with the Disabled American Veterans Organization after Forrest Gump, playing the wounded soldier in Forrest Gump, leading me to start working with our wounded. And then, September 11th happened, and I just said, I have to be a part of helping these people through this experience. And I didn't know where that was going to take me at that time. I didn't know how deep it was going to go. But clearly, after many, many years now of doing it, it's a major part of my life, and it's a service mission that I will continue until I can't do it anymore.
Right. I want to kind of dive into that Tracer's experience and your time. Give a little bit of a background on your time with Tracers and the Steppenwolf Theater and how that all began in Chicago. One of the chapters in your book is entitled, we began to look beyond ourselves. And so this is a time when it was 1980, right?
Yeah.
You become artistic director of Steppenwolf Theater.
Right.
So at that time, you're looking for plays, you're putting stuff together. Also, your kind of leadership style is kind of kicking into gear, I would say. And, I think that was an important transition for you as well, as along with, diving into those stories. You were also kind of strengthening yourself as a leader. And it actually reminded me in the book of, just kind of becoming the drill instructor almost of the cast and kicking things into shape and kicking things to the next level for Steppenwolf to really succeed. And one of the first rules you implemented was the no pot rule. Can you talk about that?
Well, Mac, talking to my son about that. Okay. Yeah, I was one of the founders of the company, but none of the three founders wanted to be the artistic director of the company. So we picked another one of our members who was really well-read and very smart and diplomatic and very good director, really talented guy.
What was his name?
His name was H.E. Bacchus, and we all just sort of appointed H.E. and said, you're going to be the artistic director. And H.E. was a very humble, sort of simple, soft-spoken guy. And at one point, H.E., and he was also a musician too. And at one point, about 3 or 4 years into the start of the theater, he just called up one day and said he didn't want to do theater anymore.
Yeah,
he wanted out. He was going to go off and do music, and he didn't want to come. And he wasn't. And it was right in the middle. He was directing a play, and he just said, "I'm not coming back. I just don't want to do it anymore." And so we had to quickly figure out who's going to finish the play because we had the opening day. We had an opening night coming up in about 2 weeks or something. So we threw Malkovich in there and made him finish directing the play. And then we had to appoint a new artistic director. And ended up being two choices. It was John and I, Malkovich or me. And
John Malkovich.
And we sat around, we debated, we talked, company meeting, everybody, and then everybody voted on who they wanted to be the artistic director. And I got most of the votes. John got a few. And I ended up being the artistic director. And so now my particular style was going to be very, very different than H.E.'s. He was very diplomatic, asking everybody what they thought all the time and, like that. And it wasn't that I didn't ask people what they thought. I just made decisions and said, we're going to have just a different way of doing things. I'm going to cast the plays. I'm going to pick the plays. I'm going to decide what we're doing. and we're going to shape things up and whatnot. Up until that point, we were kind of a little bit, just a bunch of young people in a theater, kind of partying away and doing plays, and and we were. The business office was a mess. There were papers everywhere, and it was just kind of a mess. And one day I decided to come in and lay down some ground rules. One of those was, all the staff members that were paid staff, and we were now able to pay a little bit of money to, like our stage manager and a few people, that the paid staff people would come in at 9 a.m., during the week, and, we had rules. You have to show up. Before that, everybody just show up whenever they wanted, And so I laid down rules. And then one of the rules like I said, we were a group of young people just kind of partying our way through the 70s while we did plays. It was the era of the first Saturday Night Live cast, John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd and Bill Murray and Gilda Radner, a lot of great people. And they were partying away every night, every Saturday night,
Yeah.
They finished their show, and we were kind of like that, we would just be partying away.
I feel like a lot of people in that era are just in awe that they were able to get through that.
I don't know how we got through it, but it was a party every night.
Yeah.
It was always an excuse for a party. And I just felt like I was going to shape things up a little bit and kind of try to, get us more thinking of ourselves as a business, theater, that we have to raise money, we have to sell tickets, we have to spend money, we have to have budgets, we have to, do things. And so I came in one day and I put up a sign, and it said "No pot rule."
A sign. Wow.
And the people are coming in and they're seeing the sign. It says no pot will be consumed or present in this building during working hours or something like that. It was like because people used to just be smoking pot and rolling doobies whenever they wanted and here and that. I remember coming in after I made the no pot rule. I came in one day with our board president, and I walked in, and one of the guys was sitting there rolling a doobie, and I had made the no pot rule, and he had just broken the no pot rule in front of our board president. So I quickly turned her around, took her out to her car, and said goodbye, and then came in and chewed his ass out real good. It was, and I remember. There's one story in my book, I think, where I came in. I directed a play called Waiting for the Parade, and when you direct a play, you tell them how to do all the lights and where the light cues should be, and, bring this up slow or fade it out quickly or whatever. And I came in one night during the show, and I was standing in the back, and a bunch of the light cues were messed up. They just screwed them all up. And I'm like, I'm infuriated as a director. That infuriates you.
Yeah.
And so after the show, I climbed up to the booth. You had to climb up this ladder to get up to the light booth. And I looked in there, and there's empty beer cans. The lighting people and the stage manager are all up there drinking beer during the show. And I grabbed those cans, and I threw them down, and I chewed them all out. I was going to fire them all.
Yeah.
I was just, it went
That's
from...
what you got to do,
It went from H.E. Bacchus, who was kind of a mild-mannered, just a very, sweet guy, to this sort of general Patton, kind of blowing in there.
Yeah.
And it was just a different way of doing things. And everybody in the theater will tell you, who was there back then, that, I had a very, strong, kind of forceful way of dealing with stuff. But I also, was sort of, folks started to see some real things happening for the theater. We took our first play to New York within 2 years of me becoming the artistic director, and we started moving our shows there, and then we moved into a new theater, and a lot of things happened during that time that were very productive. And, folks just had to get used to it. And the no pot rule was something that everybody just was amused with, but they got used to it.
Yeah. And so, I mean, you had a lot of great successes, and before you got to telling, Vietnam stories, you didn't have all successes, which was, I thought there was an interesting part in the book where you talk about collaborating with John Malkovich. And John wanted to do this play where it was just like tons of naked tribes people on the stage.
Yeah.
What was that play, and how did it go?
Well, in 1980, we did a very big show called Balm and Gilead, and John directed Balm and Gilead. It was a gigantic hit. It's in the lore of 45 years of Steppenwolf history. It's one of those things that hovers over everything else as one of our greatest achievements back in 1980. So it goes 80, 81, and then we did it in New York in 1984. But John had directed it, and it was a huge hit, and it had about 30 people in it. And the next play he was going to direct was a play that was written about these South American tribes people that were being kind of wiped out, in the rainforest. And in the script, it's written as there may be, it's about the politics that happen around the elimination of some of these tribes in order for profit on the rainforest materials and all that. It's kind of sad. And the way it's written by Christopher Hampton. And the way it's written is you only have like 5 or 6 people playing the tribes people, and then all the other folks that are in it. John decided he wanted to direct that show, and instead of 5 or 6 tribes people, he wanted to have 30. And in the show, the way it's written, I mean, basically they're naked on stage. They live in the jungle, and they don't. They're very primitive, and they don't have much, and they live off the land, and they're. And where do you find 30 South American tribes people when you're John Malkovich and Steppenwolf Theater?
Yeah.
So, of course, he's not going to do that back then. Today you couldn't get away with this at all.
No.
I mean, we didn't get away with it then. But
no, I bet there's some criticism on that.
But this one was really silly. And John decides he just cast like a bunch of Northwestern students and just all these young white kids who put on brown makeup and one day John told them all they were going to have to be naked on stage, and so John said, well, we're in rehearsal and we're going to have to be naked. I think we should just get naked now. And so John takes off his clothes, and then everybody takes off their clothes in rehearsal. And so now they're all naked in rehearsal, and that's how they got used to being naked. Wow. And then if you remember the Three Stooges, there was Larry, Curly, and Moe. And Moe had this kind of haircut. It was sort of, I don't know, it was like a bowl put on his head, and then they cut the hair around it. Well, those were the wigs that the tribes people wore. So you had 30 Northwestern students with these, haircuts and tan makeup on themselves, playing the tribes people.
Yeah.
And it was a very small theater too. Only maybe 3 rows and then a couple rows in the balcony. So maybe 5 rows, about 134 seats, I think it was.
Yeah.
And so you have all these naked people in this tiny little theater. And it was it was a bit misguided. The show, as Balm and Gilead kind of hovers above everything as one of our great achievements over the 45 years.
Yeah.
Savages, the play Savages, is always on the list as one of our wonderful failures.
Yeah, and it's always nice to hear those. I thought it was funny you said, Malkovich, one of the quotes, Malkovich thought it would be great to have a big group of fleshy people on stage, and I thought, why not?
I was the artistic director.
Of the getting down to business artistic director. This sounds pretty good.
And this was like my first production as artistic director.
Oh, wow. So, yeah.
So I picked the play, with John, and this was my first show, and I just backed up my director and did whatever he wanted. And, it didn't work. Nothing was right about it. But we look back and, it's just one of those, sort of
learning experience.
Yeah. It was definitely a learning experience.
Yeah. So, so now you're moving on to more plays. What can I do next? At the same time, Mom, you met Mom at the time, and she was introducing you to her family, her brothers, who are Vietnam veterans. That's the first time you got to experience and talk to Vietnam veterans, really. Her oldest brother, Mac Harris, who I'm named after, and then Arthur Harris, both Vietnam veterans. This is 81, so at this point it's like 6 years after the war or something. The war had been over for a little while.
I had met them before.
Oh, you had?
Before that, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Your mom and I really, started dating, the first summer of 1976, and the first shows we were doing we built a theater in the basement of a Catholic school that had closed down, and I was able to get them to let us use it. So we built this theater in the basement. Mom and Malkovich and Terry Kinney, Jeff Perry, Laurie Metcalf, the rest of them all graduated from Illinois State University in the spring of 1976, and then they all drove up from Illinois State up to Highland Park, which is where I was living, and where I found the basement that we could build a theater in. And we built a theater in there, and we started doing plays in that basement. So that summer, your mom and I really connected, and so it was during those mid 70s period that I met her parents, and met her brother Mac, her brother Arthur, her sister Amy, her sister's husband Jack, who was also a Vietnam veteran. I met them all in the mid to late 70s. And they started to sort of educate me a bit about Vietnam. I really started talking to them a lot about what was it like to serve in Vietnam, what was it like to come home. When you came home, they had very different experiences.
Yeah, each one, took
because Arthur came home and got out of the Army.
Right.
Mac and Jack both stayed in the Army. And it was a different experience for somebody who stayed in the Army after Vietnam versus somebody who got out. And it was much more difficult for Arthur to adjust and to deal with things because he got out, he went back to his home. There weren't a lot of veterans that he was dealing with, so he felt isolated a little bit. And Mac and Jack, they still had the support system of their brothers in arms, their fellow soldiers. So it was different for them. But I got to talk to them quite a bit about it, learned quite a lot about it, and then when I became artistic director, that's when I really started thinking, I want to find something, a piece of theater material that deals with the Vietnam experience, that tells the stories of Vietnam and what it was like to go there and what it was like to come home. And I just started looking for plays as artistic director, and I found this play that was written by a group of Vietnam veterans that was being performed here in Los Angeles by the Vietnam veterans who had written the play. And so I flew out to Los Angeles, and I went to see the play, and I was just knocked out, completely knocked out by it. And I went back to see it again the next night. My parents had moved from Chicago to Los Angeles in 1977. So when I went out to Los Angeles in 1980 to see this play or whatever, I just stayed with my parents, and I went to see the show. And I was just completely knocked out by it. So I begged them to let me do it. And eventually they gave me the rights to do it in Chicago. And just veterans from all over the city started hearing about it, and they started coming to see it. Mm-hmm. And that began some early veteran support work in Chicago that I started doing on a regular basis in 1983, 84, around in there.
Right. And, you decided to do this play, and initially the play, the reason they didn't want you to do it was because it had only been done by Vietnam veterans. The creators thought that this play can't be authentically portrayed without an all-Vietnam veteran cast. But, you obviously wanted to do it at Steppenwolf. Not everyone was a veteran. But did you try and make an effort to at least cast some Vietnam veterans in the play? I think you did have some.
I did cast two.
Okay.
We had a guy named Greg Williams and an actor named Dennis Farina.
And
Both-
was that
bo-
that was
both
all
of-
intentional to have those some of those guys in there, right?
Yeah, well, they were actors that I knew. They were perfect for the parts.
Oh, perfect.
And in fact, Dennis, he went on to do a lot of movies and everything before he passed away. And this was the first, I think, one of the first plays he ever did. He did some stuff with us in those early days. Then he went on to television series and movies and all kinds of stuff. He was a Chicago cop. But he was also a Vietnam veteran. He had, and he served in Vietnam. He knew the experience. And it was great to have both of them as a part of the cast. But the rest of the cast were not veterans. They were just actors.
Right. And then, you went on to try and immerse yourself in the Vietnam experience as much as possible. Before you even read the play, you wanted not only the audience to learn about the Vietnam veteran experience, but also the cast, So what were some of the things you did to try and immerse yourself in those experiences?
Yeah, we did a lot of things. In fact, it was pretty cool because I asked my cast members, once I cast them, and I cast them pretty early. We weren't even going to start rehearsing until January, right after Christmas. And I cast them all in like October. And I said, will you guys give me like about 5 weeks of just doing things together as a cast in preparation for playing these parts? And they all said, yeah, they wanted to be a part of this sort of 5-week workshopping of the play. We didn't even read the play, until January. All we did was this extracurricular stuff. Some being, I remember I got some firearms experts to take us out to a farm, way outside the city of Chicago, and teach us about firearms. And we shot guns out there, and with the cast. There was a series on at that time, or right around that time, on PBS called Vietnam: A Television History. And it was about a 10-part series on the Vietnam War, and it just happened to be coming on the air right around the time that we were doing this. So we as a cast sat down and watched that, at least once or twice. There were a number of books written on Vietnam that I had the cast consume. We did physical fitness stuff to get ready for it. It was going to be a very physically demanding show. So there was a lot of physical fitness. There's kind of Tai Chi, in the show. It's sort of a martial art kind of dancing moment in the show where the cast starts to do this sort of Tai Chi. And so we studied that, I had a Tai Chi expert. Every week the cast would go and work with him on that, along with the physical fitness stuff. At one point, I remember getting the cast set up to go stay at a closed down summer camp for the winter. And this is the winter time, so this is December, right? Prior to going to stay in this summer camp, and we were going to isolate ourselves in this summer camp and just do war games out there and pretend we were soldiers and all that. You know, Dennis Farina, the drill instructor, would wake us up at 3 in the morning, and I did everything along with the cast. I didn't make them do, you guys go do the workshop and tell me when you were done. I did everything with them at the same time. So I got up at 3 in the morning and went out and did calisthenics in the snow, and I mean, it was a boot camp. But prior to going to do that, I took the cast to the local VA at Great Lakes, North Chicago, and we sat there with groups of Vietnam veterans who were hospitalized, struggling with post-traumatic stress because of the experiences in Vietnam. Very, very serious experiences. And we went there and we sat with them and we listened to them talk about what they did over there. Some very, very graphic and raw, terrible things that they were living with now and having to try to get through. And they were struggling with that mentally. And they shared with us. I think it was probably as educational it was for us to sit there and listen to Vietnam veterans. It was probably in some ways healing for them to share their stories, as difficult as those stories were. But I remember coming out of those sessions with those Vietnam veterans changed. And my cast was galvanized. They now knew that they were playing these guys. These are the guys that we're playing. We're playing these guys who are struggling with their service. In fact, the first scene in Tracers is a guy in the bar who's a Vietnam veteran. And, people in the bar find out he's a Vietnam veteran. They start asking him, what's it feel like to kill somebody? Did you kill anybody over there? And blah, blah. And, they just get in his face and he goes nuts. He goes completely bananas.
Yeah, I actually wanted to touch on that because that is one thing that veterans kind of across the board seem to, part of the disconnect between veterans and the civilians is that, they actually get this question a lot. Is like, did you kill anybody? How does it feel to kill somebody? And that was a major highlight in that performance of Tracers, was touching on that question. Can you talk about that scene and why it was important to include that in the play and what that exactly means for veterans? And
yeah, you mean that first scene?
That scene where they're kind of chanting, how does it feel to kill somebody?
Yeah, well, the play starts with that.
Oh, it starts with that, yeah.
The play starts.
So it's so important.
It doesn't start with the chant, but it starts with the question.
Yeah.
That a lot of Vietnam veterans were asked, And
veterans today still are asked.
A lot of Vietnam veterans were asked, were called baby killers. And, it was just a very difficult thing to go to that war and then come home from it. And that's what this play, Tracers, was written about. What was, not only what was the Vietnam soldier, Marine experience of struggling through battles and, dealing with, the just being in Vietnam and some of the things that happened to each of them, but then coming home from it, and the difficulties of dealing with nightmares and dealing with a public that didn't understand and all of that. If part of what I've tried to do, Mac, and you talked earlier about the disconnect. I've tried to connect to our veterans, to hear them, to hear what our military families are going through, to hear what our wounded, what it's like to be wounded and to go through rehabilitation and then, struggle with your the fact that there are certain things you can't do the same way anymore and all of that. I've tried to hear what it's like for them to go through those things. And then I've tried to be part of trying to eliminate that disconnect a little bit. I don't expect people that don't have a military service member in their family or a friend who's served or anything like that to really know what it's like to serve in the military and to go off to war and come home. But we can do better to educate the public about what that's like. We need our defenders. And so I've tried to just play a role in helping them and helping others to understand them a little bit better.
Right, yeah. And I think, the reaction to the play, just going back to Tracers, it really made a difference in those veterans' lives. They gave you a plaque at the end of the play, right? Most of the Vietnam veterans from those VA hospitals end up coming to see the play multiple times, and they presented you guys, the cast, with a plaque, and one of the things that they said on it was, your unselfish endeavors to make the Vietnam combat veteran feel welcome in a society that has rejected him are greatly appreciated. So they wanted you to really know that you made a difference. And so
and that was special. I mean, not all of the veterans that we saw at the VA were able to leave the VA.
Right. Yeah.
But some of them were able to go kind of on a field trip, to come and see the play that these actors came to talk to them about. And then they came again. And then more came from around the city. And very soon we were giving away 200 free tickets to veterans every Tuesday night. And it just became a very cathartic, very healing thing for these veterans to come and see this play and then to have a discussion afterwards. And after one of those discussions, some of the veterans from the VA that we had met, they had made these wooden plaques with that writing on it that you just read, and they presented one of those plaques to each member of the cast and me. And that plaque today, I've had it all these years, going back to 1984, and because it represents very, very early veteran support work. That plaque hangs right in the foyer when you walk into the Gary Sinise Foundation. You see that, and that's what is that? 84? What is it? 36 years ago, or
right?
Whatever it is.
And that's
Is that what it is?
yeah, something like 84. That's where it all began.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
So with that, I kind of want to just close on some of the themes and things you talk about with the foundation today and how all those experiences tied together. One of the quotes you use all the time that the foundation is, burned into its ethos is a quote by Calvin Coolidge. A nation which forgets its defenders will itself be forgotten. So what do you think that quote means, and why do you think it's important for everyone to realize?
Every nation has to have a defense, right? You don't know when you're going to need to call on that defense, but you want to be prepared to defend yourselves, right? And if we don't treat the men and women who serve our country with respect and admiration and gratitude and dignity, and serve them back and keep them strong, do what we can, why would anyone want to serve their country if they feel there's an ungrateful nation out there? We learned that from the Vietnam experience. That was a terrible time for the Army, post-Vietnam. The Army was in a difficult shape. The military was in a tough spot at that time. And we learned some. I think we learned some valuable lessons there. The nation which forgets its defenders will itself be forgotten. If we forget those who are willing to stand up and fight for freedom, preserve our freedom, protect our freedom, provide it for us, we won't have those defenders. And truly, if we don't have those defenders, people that are willing to go into harm's way, to do difficult things, to keep us safe and free, our nation will itself be forgotten. You won't have the same country. We need to have a strong defense. It's a dangerous world out there. It's a difficult world. There are enemies of the United States. There are plenty of folks that would like to see this country, changed or have our defenses down. Look what happened after September 11th. Our defenses were down, and boom, airliners. Who would have thought, that terrorists would come over and take flying lessons from our instructors at flight schools around the country, and then just to learn how to fly airplanes so that they could crash them into buildings and kill people. Who would have thought that? So right after September 11th, a lot of people raised their hands. I raised my hand to do what I could. In the book, remember there was a chapter in the book called Turning Point. It really was a turning point. I think the Vietnam experience in the 80s and the work with our disabled veterans in the 90s after Forrest Gump and everything, those were just seeds that were being planted for something that grew into a whole service mission. After I watched those planes crash into the buildings, and then I watched our first responders respond, and then I watched our military respond and start going off to Afghanistan and Iraq. They started getting hurt. They started getting killed. Families lost loved ones. And sitting around and doing nothing just felt not right to me. I just felt I have to do something to help bridge this gap, to make sure that these folks that are responding to those attacks know that they're supported. And that's manifested itself into a whole full-time, full-on service mission through the Gary Sinise Foundation.
Yeah. And, that
you work for.
Yes, that I work for, exactly. I started working in 2017. But it's just an amazing foundation. It's grown so much over the 2 years. Another point that I always think about in response to Vietnam, it's like, we're talking about how hard it was for the Vietnam veteran, all the horrors that they saw, even in conflicts where there was broad support for the war. For instance, World War II. Even in those situations, people kind of think like, oh yeah, World War II veterans, they're good to go because their conscience is clear. They or at least they were taken care of better, and there was broader support coming home. It was easier for them maybe, but no matter what war it is, no matter how necessary it is or how clear fought it is, our veterans are coming back home severely wounded, both physically and mentally, for the rest of their lives often. So, and knowing that, and knowing that we have to take care of our veterans regardless of what they're going through, and what the understanding of the conflict is,
Absolutely. I mean, there's post-traumatic stress no matter what. I mean, if you go into battle, you go into combat, you see people get wounded and killed, you're going to have post-traumatic stress for a long time. And there were millions of World War II veterans that suffered what at the time was called shell shock.
Right.
But it's post-traumatic stress. It's a traumatic experience, and if you experience something traumatic over and over and over again over a number of months, sometimes a number of years, because our World War II veterans, they were in conflict. Some of those guys were gone for 3 or 4 years fighting. They're going to have some serious issues. Now, they did come home to a nation that was celebrating them, and they did have some transitional time, because they would generally come home on a ship, so they would have a lot of kind of time to decompress a little bit. But I've met World War II veterans that cry at the drop of a hat, that have had nightmares their whole life, because of the horrible things that they experienced and the horrible things they saw. And if we're going to send, men and women off to war, and we're going to, and they're going to go through those kinds of things, in defense of our freedom, I just feel, I'm a beneficiary of their sacrifices and what they go through in service and defense of freedom. And I have freedom because people are willing to defend it. We do tend to take it for granted here, but what if there was an armada of ships coming from China and across the Atlantic and or the Pacific, and what would we do? We'd have to call the military. They'd have to go defend us, right?
Yeah.
So we need a strong defense, and I just want to help our defenders. I've met too many of their families and too many of them over the years, who have really struggled and really suffered, and they don't ask much, and I just want to help them.
Yeah, well, that's amazing, and we try and continue to do that and have that be our main motivation at the Gary Sinise Foundation, to make sure that happens in all the programs we do.
Let me ask you. I mean,
Yeah.
I know for the folks that work at the foundation that have been, it's their job to help people.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty good thing. I always tell the folks at the foundation, you're here to help carry my mission forward, expand it, help me do more of it, and you get to the satisfaction in knowing that your job, what you're doing for a living right now, is simply there to help make people feel better. You look at all our programs and everything like that. All the programs are there to improve mental health, to lift people up, to raise spirits, to give them something back, which also raises their spirits. Every single program is focused on making people feel better. So it's got to make you feel good as somebody who works at the foundation to know that you're part of that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a major blessing to be able to, do for a living, just helping other people. And, I came from, you came from the theater world, and, you talk about self-to-service and going from, that kind of entertainment world into the service world. And I actually, did a similar thing. I was, in the music world. I went to USC Music School, toured as a drummer for a really long time, ended up realizing it's not the life for me, and was looking for other, career paths really, and just started working at the foundation just part-time just to help out. But it's really just become a huge blessing for me to not only dive into all the things that you've done over the years that I never really understood, but also to expand my awareness in service and how that can really be a part of my life. And so with the podcast and, various things that I'm doing and diving into, I was kind of the historian of the foundation, giving tours and trying to learn as much as your history as I can. It really allowed me to have that solid foundation for working with the foundation in the future and expanding education. So
I remember sitting with you one time when we went into the foundation on a Saturday, and I just wanted to show you around a little bit. And we sat down on the computer, and there's a page on the computer that's kind of a volunteer service history, that goes back 20 years or something. And it's all these things I've donated my time to, traveling with the troops overseas, or playing concerts, or going to the hospitals, or, raising money for somebody or something. And I went through that list and started looking back at when you were young. And I remember looking at all those dates, just one after another and one after another when I was gone. And I turned to you and said, geez, when you were 10 years old, I was gone a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And the only things I went out with you, occasionally. You took me out to, I think you played some shows at Guantanamo Bay. I went to Guantanamo Bay with you. I played drums in the band a little bit. Got to know the band over the years. But I just remember, like, one thing I could go to was going to all these awards galas, and you were just invited to one awards gala after another. I'm like, what are these galas? Like, you just keep getting the same award over and over. It's the Patriot Award. How many awards could there possibly be? And so
I know.
it was just confusing to me, but I get it all now.
Well, I wanted to have my family there with me when I was, when they invited me to come to those things.
Right. Yeah, exactly. and then now, once I started working at the foundation, I was just trying to organize all that stuff.
There's a lot of it. Yeah.
You've been awarded over the years. But thanks, Dad, for coming on the podcast. This was awesome. This is just our first one we'll do together. I'm sure we'll do many more on various subjects.
Great.
And I'm really excited about it. And thanks for doing this. It's awesome.
Love being here, Bud. Proud of you, and keep up the great work.
Awesome. Thanks. You've been listening to GSF Podcast, the official podcast of the Gary Sinise Foundation. If you'd like to find out more about what the foundation is up to, or if you'd like to make a donation, please visit GarySiniseFoundation.org. Make sure to tune in next time for more interviews, and thanks for joining us.